Get on your knees. Now, the order echoed off the granite floors. He thought she was just another black woman trespassing in his federal building. But as 35-year-old attorney Maya Sterling hit the ground, a single, devastating secret lay hidden in her mind. The morning air in the Harrison Federal Building was cool and still, carrying the faint, sterile scent of polish and bureaucracy. Sunlight, sliced into sharp, geometric patterns by the towering bronze window frames, fell across the polished granite floors. It was a place built to inspire awe and intimidation in equal measure, a cathedral of law where the scales of justice were meant to hang in perfect balance. At precisely 8:52 a.m., Maya Sterling walked through the grand entrance, her presence a quiet disruption to the monochrome rhythm of the building. At 35, she was a senior attorney for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, a position she had earned through a combination of relentless work, razor-sharp intellect, and an unwavering belief in the principles etched into the stone above her head. Her suit, a tailored emerald green, stood out against the sea of charcoal and navy. It was a deliberate choice, a silent statement of her presence and purpose. In her hand, she carried not a standard briefcase, but a custom leather folder, its rich brown surface embossed with the gold initials MS inside. It lay 2 years of her life's work. The final brief in a landmark case that had the power to redefine police accountability for a generation. She moved with an unhurried confidence, her heels clicking a steady, determined rhythm on the stone. She was here to file the brief with Judge Alastair Finch's chambers, a final step before the battle truly began. But she hadn't accounted for Officer Kevin Russo. He stood near the security checkpoint, a man who seemed molded from the same stern material as the building itself. His uniform was crisply pressed, the sleeves tight around his thick biceps, and his military-style flat-top haircut was meticulously severe. For 15 years, he had patrolled these halls, and over time, his sense of duty had curdled into a possessive, territorial arrogance. He saw the building not as a public institution, but as his domain. And as he watched Maya Sterling walk toward the restricted corridor leading to the judge's chambers, he saw not a federal prosecutor, but an anomaly, a disruption. In his narrow, prejudiced worldview, a black woman in a suit that expensive, carrying herself with that much authority, was an incongruity that needed to be corrected. He saw someone who didn't belong. "Hold on there," Russo called out, his voice a low growl that cut through the morning hum. It was a tone calibrated to command instant obedience, a tone he reserved for those he deemed beneath him. Maya paused, turning to face him. She offered a polite, professional smile, a practiced shield she had learned to deploy in the face of countless microaggressions. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Russo took a deliberate step forward, planting himself directly in her path. He ignored her question, his eyes raking over her from head to toe in a slow, insolent appraisal. "This is a restricted area. Where do you think you're going?" "I'm on my way to Judge Finch's chambers to file a brief," she explained, her voice even and calm. She held up her federal identification, the gold eagle of the Department of Justice gleaming under the atrium lights. "I'm attorney Maya Sterling." Russo barely glanced at the badge. In his mind, the narrative was already written. Judge Finch's chambers are for authorized personnel only. You can't just waltz in here. The condescension in his voice was a familiar sting. "I am authorized personnel, officer," Maya stated, keeping her tone level, as this ID clearly indicates. Other people in the lobby began to notice the exchange. A few lawyers slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued. A clerk heading to the records room paused, recognizing the familiar prelude to one of Officer Russo's power plays. Russo let out a short, derisive laugh. "Lots of people have fancy-looking IDs. Doesn't mean they're real." He crossed his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm going to need to see some other form of identification. And you need to tell me who you're really here to see." The implication was clear. She was a liar, an imposter. The calm she had so carefully maintained began to fray at the edges. "Officer, my credentials are not fancy-looking, they are federally issued. My purpose here is official business with a federal judge. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm on a deadline." She made a move to step around him, but he shifted his body, blocking her again. The physical act of obstruction elevated the confrontation from a verbal dispute to a direct challenge of her authority and her right to occupy this space. "I don't think so, girly," he sneered, the diminutive term dripping with venom. "You're not going anywhere until I'm satisfied. This is a federal building, not the mall. You don't get to just ignore security." The word girly hung in the air, a deliberate, calculated insult designed to diminish and humiliate. In that moment, Maya knew this was no longer about security protocols. It was about power. It was about race. And it was about a man who was determined to put her back in what he believed was her place. The quiet clicks of her heels had stopped. The battle had begun sooner than she expected. The tension in the lobby tightened like a knot. The ambient sounds of the courthouse, the distant murmur of conversations, the rustle of papers seemed to fade away, leaving only the charged silence between Maya and Officer Russo. Maya took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the surge of adrenaline back down. Her training as a prosecutor had prepared her for hostile witnesses and aggressive defense attorneys. But this was different. This was raw, baseless bigotry masquerading as authority. "Officer Russo," she said, her voice dropping into the cool, measured cadence she used in the courtroom. She had glanced at his name tag, and using his name was a strategic move to remind him that he was not an anonymous force, but an individual who would be held accountable. "You are interfering with the official duties of a federal officer. I have a time-sensitive document that must be filed by 9:30 a.m. If you continue to obstruct me, you will be in violation of federal law." The mention of the law, coming from her, seemed to enrage him further. The idea that she, a black woman, would dare to lecture him on his duties was an affront to his entire sense of order. His face, already flushed with anger, darkened to a deep red. "You think you can threaten me?" he snarled, taking another step closer, invading her personal space. The smell of stale coffee and self-importance radiated from him. "I'm the one in charge here. I decide who comes and goes." From the corner of her eye, Maya saw them, the smartphones. Several onlookers, sensing the escalation, had raised their devices. They were no longer passive observers. They were documentarians. The sight of the cameras should have been a warning to Russo, a signal to de-escalate. Instead, it acted as fuel. He saw it as a challenge to his authority in front of an audience. He had to win. "That's enough of your games," he shouted, his voice booming through the lobby. "I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing and impersonating a federal officer." Before Maya could even process the absurdity of the threat, he moved. It was brutally fast. One hand, thick and powerful, clamped down on her upper arm, fingers digging into the fabric of her suit and the muscle beneath. The other hand shoved hard against her shoulder. The force was jarring and unexpected. Her balance evaporated. The world tilted. For a split second, she saw the shocked faces of the onlookers, the distant bronze statue of Lady Justice, the cold, unforgiving expanse of the granite floor rushing up to meet her. She hit the ground hard. A sharp, searing pain shot through her hip and shoulder as they made impact. The custom leather folder flew from her grasp, arcing through the air. It landed with a soft slap, spilling its contents across the floor. 2 years of work, hundreds of pages of depositions, affidavits, and legal arguments scattered around her like fallen leaves. The stark, black letters on the cover pages stood out in brutal contrast to the pristine white paper. Civil Rights Division. United States Department of Justice. Confidential. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the faint rustle of a single page skittering across the floor in a draft from the main doors. Maya lay there, the initial shock giving way to a wave of humiliation and then, just as quickly, to a cold, clarifying rage. The pain in her hip was a dull throb, but the fire in her mind burned white-hot. Across the lobby, a young woman with sleek black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes gasped. Chloe Zhang, a public defender who had spent countless nights studying with Maya in the law school library 5 years ago, recognized her instantly. She saw not just a woman being assaulted, but her brilliant, formidable friend, one of the brightest legal minds she had ever known, being brutalized by a uniformed thug. "Oh my God, Maya!" Chloe's voice cut through the stunned silence. Russo stood over Maya, his chest puffed out, a triumphant sneer on his face. He had asserted his dominance. He had put the uppity woman in her place. He was oblivious to the catastrophic mistake he had just made, a mistake that was being recorded from a dozen different angles. He saw only victory. But as Maya pushed herself up onto one elbow, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, the look in her eyes was not one of defeat. It was the look of a prosecutor who had just been handed the easiest case of her career. The sight of Maya on the floor, surrounded by official Justice Department documents, acted as a catalyst. The spell of shocked silence was broken, replaced by a wave of frantic murmurs and the distinct, clicking sounds of phone cameras recording. Officer Russo, still basking in the glow of his perceived victory, was about to have his world dismantled piece by piece in front of a live audience. Chloe Zhang didn't hesitate. Pushing through the small crowd that had formed, she strode forward, her own briefcase swinging at her side like a weapon. Her face was a mask of fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a seasoned public defender used to confronting injustice. She knelt beside Maya, helping her sit up. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Maya said, her voice tight but controlled. The pain was a secondary concern. Her focus was already shifting, analyzing, preparing. Russo turned his sneer on Chloe. "Stay out of this, counselor. This woman is being detained for trespassing. Mind your own business." Chloe stood up, placing herself between Russo and Maya. She was shorter than him, but she seemed to tower over him in that moment. "This is my business," she shot back, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "And it's about to become the business of the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Office of Inspector General, and every news outlet in this city. Do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" Russo's confidence began to flicker. He looked from Chloe's furious face to Maya, who was now slowly, deliberately gathering her scattered papers. "She's an activist, a troublemaker. You colossal idiot," Chloe said, the insult delivered with surgical precision. "That's Maya Sterling. She's not just a federal attorney. You just assaulted one of the lead prosecutors for the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. You are finished." The words detonated in the lobby. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The murmurs exploded into exclamations of disbelief. A DOJ prosecutor? He assaulted a Fed? A lawyer standing nearby cursed under his breath, shaking his head. The people who had been passively filming now held their phones up with a new urgency, realizing they were capturing not just an incident, but the self-immolation of a federal officer's career. Russo's face went through a rapid, visible transformation. The triumphant smirk froze, cracked, and then crumbled entirely. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. His eyes, which had been filled with arrogant certainty, now darted around, wide with the first glimmers of genuine panic. He looked at the official documents on the floor, truly seeing the bold, damning letterhead for the first time. United States Department of Justice. That's not possible, he stammered, his voice losing all its earlier bravado. It was a weak, desperate denial against a tidal wave of reality. Maya had gathered the last of her papers. She rose to her feet with a grace that defied the violent way she had been brought down. She brushed the dust from her emerald suit, her movements calm and methodical. The pain in her hip was a sharp, insistent reminder of the assault, but she ignored it. When she finally looked at Kevin Russo, her eyes were cold and clear, devoid of any emotion except a chilling, professional focus. The victim was gone. The prosecutor was here. "Officer Kevin Russo," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the now silent lobby. "A few moments ago, you accused me of impersonating a federal officer. The irony is that it is you who have failed to act as one. You have, under the color of law, committed battery. You have violated my civil rights. And you have obstructed a federal investigation." Each sentence was a perfectly aimed blow, a legal indictment delivered with devastating calm. Russo opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route, but he was trapped in the center of a circle of silent, judging faces and the unblinking eyes of a dozen smartphone lenses. He had built his little kingdom on a foundation of bigotry and intimidation, and in the space of 5 minutes, he had brought it crashing down upon his own head. Just as the full weight of the catastrophe seemed to settle on Kevin Russo, a new figure appeared, parting the crowd like a ship through water. He was a tall, slender man in his late 60s with a mane of silver hair and a face that looked as though it were carved from granite. This was Judge Alastair Finch, and his presence commanded an immediate, almost gravitational shift in the lobby's atmosphere. He had been in his chambers, preparing for the day, when the commotion had become too loud to ignore. What in God's name is going on out here? Judge Finch's voice was not loud, but it possessed a deep, resonant authority that instantly silenced the remaining whispers. Every eye turned to him. Before Russo could formulate a response, a man in a rumpled suit hurried to the judge's side. Alan Vance, the building's senior administrative officer, had a practiced, placating smile already fixed on his face. His primary function was to make problems disappear. Judge Finch, my apologies for the disturbance, Vance began, casting a dismissive glance at Maya. Just a small misunderstanding with security. Officer Russo was simply following protocol. We have it all under control. Maya stepped forward, her gaze locking with the judge's. She would not allow this to be swept under the rug. With all due respect, Mr. Vance, this was not a misunderstanding, and it is far from under control. Judge Finch's sharp eyes moved from Vance's oily smile to Maya's composed but resolute face, then to the documents she held clutched in her hand, and finally to Russo, who looked like a cornered animal. A misunderstanding that results in an attorney on my floor, surrounded by her scattered legal briefs? The judge asked, his voice laced with ice. He turned his full attention to Maya. Ma'am, would you care to explain what happened? Certainly, Your Honor, Maya said, her voice clear and steady. I am attorney Maya Sterling, with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. I was on my way to your chambers to file this brief when Officer Russo physically blocked my path, refused to look at my federal credentials, accused me of being an imposter, and then assaulted me, throwing me to the floor. Vance paled, his placating smile vanishing. Now, I'm sure there's a less dramatic version of events. Is there, Mr. Vance? Judge Finch cut him off, his tone making it clear he would tolerate no more bureaucratic maneuvering. He looked at Russo. Officer, is what Ms. Sterling says true? Russo, seeing the judge's thunderous expression, scrambled for a defense. Your Honor, she was being uncooperative. She refused to identify herself properly. I had reason to believe she was a security threat. That is an absolute lie, Chloe Zhang interjected, stepping forward again. I witnessed the entire thing. Attorney Sterling identified herself multiple times. He called her girly and refused to even glance at her badge. Judge Finch's gaze swept across the crowd of onlookers. Did anyone else witness this exchange? For a moment, there was a hesitant silence. Then, a hand went up. It belonged to a young court clerk who had often been the target of Russo's less aggressive but equally demeaning comments. Emboldened by the judge's presence, she spoke up. I saw it, Your Honor. She told him who she was. He just laughed at her. Another hand went up. A lawyer who had been on his way to the cafeteria. He was completely out of line, aggressive from the start. One by one, a half-dozen people, court staff, lawyers, even a juror on a break, corroborated Maya's story. Each testimony was another nail in Russo's coffin, dismantling his lies and exposing the raw, ugly truth of his actions. The institutional apathy that had protected him for years was evaporating before his eyes under the heat of a judge's focused outrage. Vance looked desperately for a way to regain control, but it was too late. Judge Finch had taken charge. The small misunderstanding had become a federal case in the middle of his lobby. Mr. Vance, the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. It appears your officer's protocol involves assaulting federal prosecutors. I suggest you secure all security footage of this lobby for the last hour. Officer Russo, you will surrender your badge and service weapon. You are on administrative leave, effective immediately. Do not leave this building." He then turned to Maya, his expression softening with professional concern. "Attorney Sterling, please accompany me to my chambers. We have a great deal to discuss." Judge Finch's chambers were an oasis of calm and order, a stark contrast to the chaos in the lobby. The walls were lined with leather-bound law books, and a large mahogany desk sat before a window overlooking the city skyline. The judge closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the rest of the world. The silence was a relief. "Ms. Sterling, please have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. "First and foremost, are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" "I'm bruised, Your Honor, but I'll be fine," Maya replied, though a deep ache was beginning to radiate from her hip. "Thank you for your intervention." "It was my duty," the judge said grimly, settling into his own chair. He looked at the leather folder she had placed on his desk. The corner was scuffed from the fall. "Now, you mentioned you were here to file a brief. I confess, my curiosity is piqued. What matter could be so urgent?" Maya opened the folder and carefully slid the thick document across the polished surface of the desk. The title on the cover page was stark and unambiguous: United States of America v. Sterling City Police Department. Judge Finch read the title, and his eyebrows shot up. He was well aware of the rumors of a major DOJ investigation into the local police force, but this was the first confirmation he had seen. He opened the brief and began to read the executive summary, his expression growing more intent with every line. "Your Honor," Maya began, her voice regaining its full prosecutorial strength. "This lawsuit is the culmination of a 2-year investigation into the SCPD. We have compiled over 10,000 pages of evidence documenting a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing. This includes systematic racial discrimination in traffic stops and street detentions, the disproportionate use of excessive force against Black and Latino citizens, and a deeply entrenched code of silence that actively covers up misconduct." The judge looked up from the brief, his face grave. He had presided over dozens of cases involving allegations of police misconduct, but the scope of what Maya was describing was on another level entirely. "This is comprehensive," he said, an understatement. "We have identified 47 officers with a documented history of racially motivated violence who have never faced meaningful discipline," Maya continued, her passion for the case overriding the morning's trauma. "We have sworn testimony from whistleblowers within the department. We have statistical analysis that is, frankly, damning. This lawsuit isn't just about seeking damages, Your Honor. It's about forcing a complete overhaul of a corrupt and broken system." She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the room. Then, she connected the abstract legal battle to the very real violence she had just experienced. The irony, of course, is that Officer Russo's behavior is a perfect, textbook example of the very issues this lawsuit is designed to address. The baseless suspicion, the immediate escalation, the abuse of authority based on racial prejudice, the assumption that a person of color in a position of power must be an imposter. "It's all in here," she said, tapping a finger on the brief. "He is the living embodiment of the problem." Judge Finch leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. He stared at the document, then at Maya, a look of dawning, horrified understanding on his face. The sheer, staggering irony of the situation was almost poetic in its cruelty. "So, let me be perfectly clear," the judge said slowly, his voice heavy with the implications. "While you were attempting to file a landmark federal lawsuit to combat institutional racism and the abuse of power by law enforcement, you were physically assaulted and racially profiled by a federal law enforcement officer in a lobby of a federal courthouse. That is a succinct and accurate summary, Your Honor," Maya confirmed. The judge was silent for a long moment, the magnitude of the event settling over him. This was no longer just an assault on an individual. It was an attack on the very process of justice. The system hadn't just failed Maya Sterling in that moment. It had actively tried to silence the person who was fighting to fix it. Ms. Sterling," Judge Finch said, his voice now filled with a cold, hard resolve. "What happened to you today is an outrage. It is an affront to this institution and everything it is supposed to stand for. I assure you, this will not be swept away. Officer Russo has provided a live demonstration for your lawsuit. It's only fitting that his own case now becomes a part of it." Within an hour, the Harrison Federal Building was buzzing with a new kind of energy. The Internal Affairs Division had been activated, but Judge Finch, knowing the insular nature of such departments, had made a call directly to the Department of Justice. By noon, Special Agent Eva Rostova from the Office of Inspector General had arrived. Rostova was a legend within the OIG, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for dismantling corruption wherever she found it. She had a mind like a steel trap and zero tolerance for institutional cover-ups. Her first order of business was to take charge of the investigation, sidelining Alan Vance and the building's internal team. "My team will handle this," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Secure Officer Russo's locker, his personnel file, and every second of security footage from every camera in this building for the past 72 hours. And I want his full, unedited radio transmission log for the last month. While technicians began the painstaking process of collecting and archiving data, Rostova met with Maya and Judge Finch in a secure conference room. She listened intently as Maya recounted the incident, her gaze never wavering, her expression unreadable. She was a collector of facts, not emotions. His language, his immediate hostility, it felt practiced, Maya concluded. This wasn't his first time. "My thoughts exactly, Attorney Sterling," Rostova said, making a note on her tablet. "Men like Russo don't just snap. They build up to it, enabled by a system that looks the other way. Our job is to expose the system." It was the radio logs that provided the first major breakthrough. Every federal officer's radio was equipped with a digital recorder that captured all transmissions. It was standard procedure, a tool for accountability that was more often than not ignored. Rostova's team began isolating all of Kevin Russo's communications from that morning. Late in the afternoon, a young tech specialist called Agent Rostova over to his workstation. "Agent, you need to hear this." The conference room fell silent as the technician played the audio file. The timestamp was 8:48 a.m., 4 minutes before Russo confronted Maya. The voice was unmistakably his, casual, confident, and utterly vile. "Hey Dave, you see this?" Russo's voice crackled through the speakers, speaking to another officer. "Got one of them coming through the main entrance. Fancy suit, walking like she owns the place. Think she's hot stuff." There was a pause, then another officer's voice, bored and indistinct. "Yeah? So what?" "So, I think it's time someone taught her a little lesson about where she belongs," Russo replied, and his voice took on a conspiratorial, venomous tone. "Gonna go have some fun. Watch this. I'm about to put this little..." He then used a disgusting, explicit racial slur. "Right back in her place." A wave of revulsion washed over the room. Judge Finch's face was pale, his hands clenched into tight fists on the table. The DOJ officials looked at each other in stunned horror. This wasn't just a case of an officer losing his temper or making a bad judgment call. This was a premeditated, racially motivated act of aggression. He had announced his criminal intent on a recorded federal channel. But he wasn't finished. Tired of them coming in here, acting all-important, Russo's voice continued, filled with a lifetime of resentment. "This is my house. Time for a reminder." The technician stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than before. Everyone in the room understood the gravity of what they had just heard. It was the smoking gun, a self-narrated confession. Maya sat perfectly still, the vile words echoing in her mind. She had faced racism her entire life, in its subtle and overt forms. But to hear it laid bare with such casual cruelty, to know that the attack was not just impulsive but planned, was a unique kind of poison. A flicker of deep, personal pain crossed her face before being replaced by an expression of pure, unyielding steel. "He just handed us a federal hate crime charge on a silver platter. one of the DOJ lawyers whispered, his voice filled with awe and disgust. Agent Rostova's expression was grim. This is ironclad. Premeditation, racial animus, intent to violate civil rights under the color of law. He recorded his own indictment. She looked at her team. Pull his logs for the entire month. I want to know how many other lessons he's taught. The investigation had just escalated dramatically. It was no longer about a single assault. It was about a pattern of behavior, a campaign of racist harassment conducted by a federal officer on government time, using government equipment. And as Agent Rostova prepared to deliver the news to the U.S. attorney, she had no idea that the most shocking discovery was yet to come, hidden not in an audio file, but in a simple, paper personnel record. While one team of investigators meticulously combed through months of Kevin Russo's racist radio chatter, another was dissecting his life on paper. His personnel file was thick, detailing a 15-year career that, on the surface, was unremarkable. Commendations for punctuality, standard performance reviews, and a few minor reprimands for tardiness. But buried deep within the bureaucratic forms was a section that was about to turn the entire case on its head. Emergency contact information. Agent Rostova was reviewing the file in her temporary command center when she saw it. The name was listed in neat, typed letters, unchanged for 15 years. Emergency contact, Elena Sterling. Relationship, adoptive mother. Rostova stared at the words, her mind refusing to process them. Elena Sterling. It had to be a coincidence, a common name. But the address listed for the emergency contact matched the one on file for attorney Maya Sterling's mother. Her heart began to pound. She picked up her phone and called the building's human resources department, the one Alan Vance had previously overseen. This is Special Agent Rostova. I need you to verify the emergency contact information for Officer Kevin Russo. I want you to pull the original intake forms from 15 years ago. Now, she waited, the silence in the room stretching for an eternity. She could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. Finally, the HR clerk came back on. Agent, it's confirmed. The original file lists Elena Sterling as his adoptive mother. There's even a signed character reference from her in his application packet. She vouched for him. Rostova hung up the phone, a cold dread settling in her stomach. It wasn't a coincidence. The man who had viciously assaulted Maya Sterling, the man who had spewed racist venom about her on a recorded line, had been raised by her mother. They were family, adoptive siblings. The revelation was so staggering, so profoundly disturbing, that it seemed to defy all logic. How could one woman, one household, produce both a passionate champion for civil rights and a violent, bigoted enforcer of the very system she fought against? The case had just gone from being a straightforward, if egregious, civil rights violation to a twisted, heartbreaking family tragedy. She knew she had to tell Maya. This information would change everything. Not legally, but personally. The emotional toll of prosecuting a case is immense. The toll of prosecuting your own brother would be unimaginable. She found Maya in the small, temporary office they had assigned her, where she was reviewing the first batch of witness statements. Her focus was absolute. Attorney Sterling, Rostova began, her voice softer than usual. Can we speak for a moment? There's been a development. Maya looked up, sensing the gravity in the agent's tone. What is it? Did you find more recordings? In a way, Rostova said, closing the door behind her. She took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say it. While reviewing Officer Russo's personnel file, we found his emergency contact information. Maya, his listed adoptive mother, is Elena Sterling. Maya stared at her, her expression blank. The name didn't seem to register at first. It was a piece of data that her brain couldn't fit into any existing framework. Elena Sterling? My mother, she asked, her voice a near whisper. It sounded absurd. According to his file, she adopted him when he was 20 years old, about the time you started college, Rostova explained gently. She provided a character reference for this job. She's been his emergency contact ever since. The color drained from Maya's face. The witness statements in her hand fell to her lap. Her mind, usually so quick and analytical, was a storm of confusion and disbelief. Her mother had another child? A son? And that son was him? No, she said, shaking her head slowly. That's not possible. I would know. My mother would have told me. But even as she said it, fragmented memories began to surface. Vague references over the years to a young man she was mentoring. Phone calls her mother would take in another room. Unexplained expenses that were brushed off as donations to a community program. Elena had always been a private woman, fiercely protective of the people she helped. Maya had respected that, never prying. She had assumed it was just another one of her mother's countless charitable endeavors. The truth was so much more complicated, so much more painful. Her mother hadn't just mentored a young man. She had opened her home and her heart to him. She had given him their name. She had made him family. He knew, Maya whispered, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. When he saw me, he knew who I was. The assault wasn't just an attack on a random black woman. It was an attack on his sister. The sister who represented everything he had come to hate, everything he had rejected. The professional outrage she had felt was suddenly eclipsed by a wave of profound, personal betrayal. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a wound in the heart of her own family. Agent Rostova watched her, her expression filled with a rare sympathy. The legal case was strong, but the human cost had just become immeasurable. The phone call to Elena Sterling was the hardest Maya had ever had to make. Agent Rostova sat with her, a silent, supportive presence in the sterile conference room. Maya's hand trembled slightly as she dialed the number she knew by heart. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice warm and full of concern. Maya, sweetheart, I've been seeing reports on the news about some kind of incident at the federal building. Are you all right? I was so worried. Maya closed her eyes, a lump forming in her throat. Mom, she began, her own voice sounding distant and strained. I'm okay, but something has happened. I need you to sit down. This is going to be very difficult to hear. A pause on the other end of the line. Elena's maternal intuition immediately sensed the gravity. What is it, baby? What's wrong? Maya took a shaky breath. Mom, the officer who assaulted me today at the courthouse. It was Kevin. Kevin Russo. The silence that followed was absolute, a void of shock and disbelief. Maya could picture her mother in her cozy living room, surrounded by books on social justice and photos of her daughter, trying to reconcile the two halves of that sentence. The son she had tried to save and the daughter she had raised to be a warrior for justice, locked in a violent public collision. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was a shattered whisper. No, that's not possible. Kevin wouldn't hurt you. He knows who you are. He knows you're his sister. He knew, Mom, Maya said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. And he did anyway. We have recordings of him, Mom. Planning it. He used racial slurs. Horrible, disgusting words. He said he was going to teach me a lesson. The sound that came through the phone was one of pure, unrestrained grief. It was a mother's sob, a sound of primal pain, the sound of a heart breaking. It was the sound of 25 years of hope and effort turning to dust. I don't understand, Elena cried, her voice choked with tears. I raised him better. I taught him about our history, about dignity, about respect. We read Baldwin together. I took him to the King Memorial. How could he become this? How could he hate what I taught him to love? Listening to her mother's anguish, Maya felt her own heart break anew. This wasn't Elena's failure. It was Kevin's choice. This is not your fault, Mom, Maya said, her voice firm despite her own pain. You gave him a home. You gave him love. You gave him every chance to be a good man. Some poisons run too deep. He chose to embrace them. Through her tears, Elena's mind flashed back. She remembered a troubled, angry 20-year-old on her doorstep, a young man who had been chewed up and spit out by the foster care system. She had seen a flicker of potential in his eyes and had believed her love could nurture it. She remembered his pride at his high school graduation, the way he had hugged her and said, "You saved my life, Elena." Where had that boy gone? Mom, Maya said, pulling her back to the present. There's something else you need to know. The case I was filing, the lawsuit against the SCPD, it's going forward. And what Kevin did is now a central piece of it. This is going to be very public. Our family, it's going to be at the center of this storm. There was a shift in Elena's breathing. The sobs subsided, replaced by the ragged, determined breaths of a woman who had spent her entire life on the front lines of the fight for justice. The mother was grieving, but the activist was rising. "What do you need me to do?" Elena asked, her voice still trembling but regaining a sliver of its usual strength. This was the moment, the crux of it all. "I need you to be strong," Maya said, "because his lawyers are going to use our family connection. They'll try to paint this as a family squabble, a misunderstanding. They will ask you to stand by him. Mom, I need you to choose justice, not family." The request was monumental, almost cruel, to ask a mother to publicly stand against her son. But Maya knew it was necessary. Elena was silent for a long time. Maya could hear the silent, titanic struggle happening on the other end of the line. Then, Elena spoke, and her voice was clear and resolute, forged in the fire of a lifetime of conviction. "I have spent my life fighting hatred, Maya. I cannot give it shelter in my own home, and I will not defend it in a court of law." Kevin made his choice. Now I have to make mine. I stand with you. I stand with justice. In that moment, Elena Sterling chose her principles over her pain. She chose the daughter who embodied her values over the son who had betrayed them. It was a choice that would cost her dearly, but it was the only one she could live with. The family was broken, but its moral compass was not. 3 days later, Elena Sterling walked down the same granite corridor where her daughter had been thrown to the floor. The air was still thick with the memory of the event. She moved with a purpose that belied the crushing weight on her soul. Her head was held high, but her eyes held a universe of sorrow. Kevin was waiting for her near the entrance to a small conference room, flanked by his union representative and a sharp-suited defense attorney. When he saw Elena, his carefully constructed composure shattered. For a moment, he wasn't a disgraced federal officer. He was just a frightened young man seeing the woman whose approval he had always craved. "Elena," he said, his voice cracking. He took a step toward her. "Thank you for coming. I knew you'd be here for me. I knew you wouldn't abandon me." Elena stopped a few feet away from him, creating a physical and emotional chasm between them. She looked at the man she had called her son, searching his face for a hint of the boy she had tried to raise, a glimmer of genuine remorse. She found none, only fear. "I'm not here for you, Kevin," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I am here for the truth. I came to give you one last chance to tell it, to apologize, to take responsibility for what you have done." His attorney, Richard Sullivan, immediately stepped in. "Mrs. Sterling, with all due respect, I've advised my client not to make any statements." Elena's gaze snapped to Sullivan, and it was like staring into the sun. "I am not speaking to your client, Mr. Sullivan. I am speaking to the boy I taught to read using the speeches of Dr. King. I am speaking to the young man who promised me he would spend his life proving that where you start doesn't have to be where you end up. I am speaking to the person who chose to betray every single one of those lessons." The words struck Kevin like physical blows. He had rehearsed a speech with his lawyer, a narrative of misunderstanding and regret. He had expected Elena to provide a tearful, maternal shield. He had not expected this righteous, heartbreaking fury. "Elena, you don't understand," he pleaded, his voice desperate. "It wasn't like that. I was just doing my job. I didn't know it was Maya at first. I swear." "Stop," Elena commanded, and her voice, though filled with pain, silenced the entire hallway. From her handbag, she pulled out a thin manila folder. "Stop lying, Kevin. Not to me." She opened the folder. "I've seen the evidence. I've heard the recordings." Her voice broke for a second, but she forced it steady. "I have heard you plan to assault my daughter, your sister, using words so full of hate I couldn't even repeat them. I have heard you talk about people who look like me, who look like Maya, with a venom that has poisoned your soul." Kevin's face crumpled. He knew. She knew everything. The carefully constructed wall of denial he had built around himself was gone, washed away by the tide of her knowledge. "But I can change," he cried, tears now streaming down his face. "I can get help. You always taught me that redemption is possible. You said no one is beyond saving. I did say that, Elena said, her own tears finally escaping, tracing paths down her cheeks. And I still want to believe it. But redemption, Kevin, begins with remorse. It begins with honesty. All I see from you is a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of your choices. The union rep, a portly man named Morton, stepped forward. Mrs. Sterling, Kevin has been a loyal employee for 15 years. One mistake. Elena's voice rose, echoing off the cold stone. She held up the folder. This wasn't one mistake. This was the one that got caught. She began pulling out pages. 15 formal complaints of racial harassment filed against you over the last 5 years. An attorney you detained for 20 minutes because you didn't believe his credentials. A law student you barred from the library. A public defender you accused of being in a gang. 15 people, Kevin. 15 people whose voices were silenced, whose complaints were buried by the very system you now want to protect you. How many chances does one man deserve? The documents were a devastating testament to his long history of bigotry. Kevin stared at them, then back at his mother's heartbroken face. His attorney tried one last time. Mrs. Sterling, he is your son. Family loyalty. Family loyalty? Elena's voice was a raw cry of anguish. You want to talk to me about loyalty? I showed you loyalty for 25 years. I gave you a home. I gave you an education. I gave you my love unconditionally. I gave you my daughter as a sister. And you repaid that loyalty by spitting on every value I hold dear and attacking the one person I raised to defend them. She looked at him, her heart shattering into a million pieces. I gave you everything I had, Kevin, and you chose to become this. He finally broke, collapsing into a nearby chair, his body racked with sobs. He understood now. He hadn't just lost his job. He hadn't just lost his freedom. He had lost the only person who had ever truly believed in him. Elena looked at her son one last time, memorizing the face of the man who was a stranger to her. My family, she said, her voice regaining its strength, is the community of people who fight for what is right. You chose to leave that family a long time ago, Kevin. I will not abandon my true family to protect a man who has abandoned everything I believe in. With those final, devastating words, Elena Sterling turned and walked away. The sound of her footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridor was the sound of a door closing forever. 6 weeks later, the case of United States versus Kevin Russo convened in Judge Alastair Finch's courtroom. The gallery was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and members of the public who had been captivated by the story's dramatic turns. The air was thick with anticipation. Kevin Russo, looking gaunt and diminished in a suit that hung loosely on his frame, stood beside his attorney. The swagger was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out look of a man who had lost everything. The evidence against him, the video footage, the dozens of witness statements, and above all, the chilling audio recording of his own voice, was so overwhelming that a trial would have been a futile exercise. A plea agreement had been reached. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chun, who was prosecuting the case, stood before the bench. Your Honor, the government has compiled an irrefutable case against the defendant. This was not an act of negligence or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a premeditated, racially motivated hate crime, an attack not only on Attorney Sterling, but on the very principles of equality and justice this courthouse is sworn to uphold. Chun played the audio recording one last time for the court. The vile, racist slur was bleeped out, but the hatred in Russo's voice was still palpable, filling the grand courtroom with its ugliness. A wave of disgust rippled through the gallery. Judge Finch's face was a mask of judicial severity. Mr. Russo, he said, his voice resonating with cold authority. You are charged with the violation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony. How do you plead? Russo's shoulders slumped. He looked up, his eyes briefly finding Elena and Maya, who sat together in the front row. They were a united front of quiet strength and sorrow. He looked away, unable to bear their gaze. Guilty, Your Honor, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. A sigh of relief and resolution went through the courtroom. Justice, it seemed, will be served before I accept this plea and impose a sentence. Judge Finch continued, his gaze fixed on Russo. I want you to understand the full gravity of your actions. You did not merely assault a prosecutor. You desecrated this house of law. You used the authority granted to you by the people of this nation to enact your own petty, hateful prejudices. You became the very corruption that our laws are designed to eradicate. The judge paused, his words hanging in the air. Furthermore, your crime is compounded by an act of profound personal betrayal. You were raised in a home dedicated to the fight for equality. You were given the love and guidance of a woman, Ms. Elena Sterling, who is a pillar of that cause. You repaid that love by attacking her daughter, your own sister. That is a stain that no prison sentence can ever wash away. Russo began to weep openly, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. However, the judge said, his tone shifting slightly, the court is in receipt of a letter from Ms. Elena Sterling. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. In it, she does not ask for leniency. She asks for justice. But she also writes, and I quote, while my son must be held accountable for the hatred he chose, I still hold on to the hope that the man I try to raise is not lost forever. I pray that in the years to come, he can find a path back to the values he was taught. It is a testament to her boundless grace that even now, she does not give up on the possibility of your redemption. The letter was Elena's final, painful act of motherhood, not to excuse his crime, but to preserve a flicker of hope for the man, if not the son. Judge Finch set the letter down. Taking into account the severity of your crime, the irrefutable evidence of your guilt, your plea, and the profound need to send an unequivocal message that such behavior will not be tolerated in our federal institutions, it is the sentence of this court that you, Kevin Russo, be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term of 5 years. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay restitution to attorney Maya Sterling in the amount of $500,000 for the violation of her civil rights and the emotional distress caused. And upon your release, you will be subject to 3 years of supervised probation, during which you will be required to complete intensive anti-bigotry and racial sensitivity training. Perhaps, Mr. Russo, you can finally learn the lessons your mother tried so desperately to teach you. The gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. It was over. Justice had been rendered, severe and absolute. As Russo was led away in handcuffs, Maya reached over and took her mother's hand. Tears streamed down Elena's face. Tears of sorrow, of relief, of a pain so deep it would never fully heal. The legal battle was won, but the family wound would remain forever. The sentencing of Kevin Russo was not an end, but a beginning. The shockwaves from his case radiated outward from Judge Finch's courtroom, triggering a long overdue institutional earthquake. The high-profile nature of the crime, a federal officer assaulting a DOJ prosecutor while she was filing a civil rights lawsuit, made it impossible to ignore. The story was a national sensation, a searing indictment of the rot that can fester within the halls of justice. Agent Eva Rostova's investigation, which had started with one man, expanded into a full-scale audit of the Harrison Federal Building's administration and the Sterling City Police Department. Her final report was a scathing exposé of systemic failure. It detailed how Kevin Russo's 15 complaints of harassment had been systematically downplayed, buried, or dismissed by a chain of command more interested in avoiding controversy than upholding standards. The consequences were swift and decisive. Alan Vance, the administrative officer who had tried to label the assault a misunderstanding, was fired. 12 other supervisors and HR personnel, all of whom had at some point signed off on dismissing a complaint against Russo, were either forced into early retirement or demoted. A new zero-tolerance anti-discrimination policy was implemented, along with mandatory quarterly reviews of all security communications and an independent, anonymous channel for reporting misconduct. The system that had protected Kevin Russo was dismantled, but the most significant impact was on Maya's lawsuit. The assault on her had become Exhibit A in her case against the Sterling City Police Department. It was undeniable proof of the culture of impunity she had been fighting to expose. The city's lawyers, facing a public relations nightmare and the mountain of evidence Maya had already compiled, saw the writing on the wall. They quickly moved to settle. The settlement was historic. The city agreed to pay $50 million to a fund for victims of police brutality and to enter into a federal consent decree, subjecting the SCPD to years of oversight by the Department of Justice. The decree mandated a complete overhaul of their training protocols, use of force policies, and disciplinary systems. The 47 officers Maya's investigation had flagged were placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a new, federally supervised review. The victory was monumental. News headlines across the country celebrated the outcome. A montage of change began to play out in the city. New police recruits being trained in de-escalation, a civilian review board being sworn in, and Maya Sterling standing on the steps of City Hall, announcing the settlement to a crowd of cheering citizens and tearful families who had waited years for this moment. Maya's personal trauma had been forged into a weapon for systemic change. Kevin Russo, in his blind hatred, had intended to silence a voice for justice. Instead, he had amplified it, turning it into a roar that was heard across the nation. He had sought to prove she didn't belong in the halls of power. Instead, he had cemented her place there and given her the leverage to tear down the corrupt structures he represented. The ultimate irony was that his name would forever be linked not to the power he abused, but to the reforms that his downfall made possible. The system had been shaken to its core, all because one man picked the wrong woman to attack on the wrong day. 1 year later, Maya Sterling stood in a different, even more imposing hall of power, a hearing room of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C. The harsh glare of the television lights was a familiar pressure now. She was no longer just a prosecutor. She had become a symbol of resilience and a leading voice for national police reform. Senators, she began, her voice calm and confident. My experience was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a disease that infects law enforcement agencies across this country. A culture of insufficient accountability, a tolerance for bias, and a system that too often protects perpetrators at the expense of victims. In the front row of the audience sat Elena Sterling. The past year had transformed her. She had channeled her grief into action, founding a non-profit organization that supported families torn apart by extremism and hate. She was no longer just a mother. She was a national advocate, her personal tragedy giving her a powerful, authentic voice. She watched her daughter now, her face a portrait of immense pride and lingering sorrow. Maya was there to advocate for a new piece of federal legislation. It was a comprehensive bill that would mandate national standards for police conduct, create a federal database of officer misconduct, and strip legal immunity from officers found guilty of civil rights violations. In a move of profound and bitter irony, the bill's official name was the Russo Civil Rights Accountability Act. A senator from the opposing party questioned her. "Attorney Sterling, while your story is compelling, is it truly wise to name a national law after a single disgraced officer? Does that not give him a form of immortality?" Maya's answer was ready. "Senator, this bill is not named to honor him. It is named to serve as a permanent reminder. A reminder of what happens when we allow bigotry to fester in our institutions. A reminder that the system that produced Kevin Russo is the system we are here to dismantle. His name on this law will not be a monument. It will be a warning." 6 months later, the bill was signed into law. Back in Sterling City, the federal courthouse felt like a different place. As Maya walked through the granite lobby, the same space where she had been assaulted, she saw the changes firsthand. The security officers were more diverse, their interactions with the public more professional and courteous. On the wall near the entrance, a new bronze plaque had been installed. It didn't mention her name or Kevin's, but it read, "This building is dedicated to the principle of equal justice under law. May all who enter here be judged not by their appearance, but by their actions and the content of their character." Kevin, serving his sentence in a federal penitentiary, had enrolled in a program focused on de-radicalization and restorative justice. His counselor sent monthly reports to Elena. They were filled with cautious optimism, noting that he was beginning, for the first time, to comprehend the depth of the pain he had caused. Redemption was a long, uncertain road, but it was no longer impossible. Maya stopped in the middle of the lobby, the place where she had fallen. She carried a new leather folder, filled with the details of her next case. The fight was never truly over, but looking around at the quiet, orderly, and more just space, she felt a sense of profound, hard-won peace. Her brother's hatred had inadvertently become the catalyst for healing. The family he had shattered had found a new purpose. The system he had served had been forced to reform. The values he had rejected had, in the end, triumphed. Elena's choice had shown the world what true courage looks like. In the comments below, type courage if you believe that standing for justice sometimes requires us to make the most difficult choices of all. Please share this story to spread the message, and subscribe to our channel to witness more incredible tales of strength and transformation. And as always, please comment with respect.